A warm welcome back to our history show here on Uxbridge FM. And Ken Pearce is back again with another famous talk, and this time about a flying display over Uxbridge. Sounds interesting, Ken?
Well, I hope so. Thank you. In 1913, our local paper reported this. On the 20th of October, an aeroplane flew over the town. Well, it was news in those days. Aviation was in the early stages, and an aeroplane seen over the area was quite a noticeable event. The planes in those days were, of course, very small. They weighed very little. They were made mostly of wood. And indeed, as we shall see, they didn't cope very well with bad weather. This will become apparent in the incident that follows. In 1913, a young man called George Lee Temple, aged 21, was hitting the headlines. He had taken up flying in 1912 and had taught himself to fly in a Blériot aircraft. He then bought a Caudron biplane, and in 1913 he opened a flying school at Hendon for a few months. But then he gave this up to do exhibition flights, and on November the 25th, in one of those flights, he became the first Englishman to fly upside down. By this time, he was using a Blériot monoplane, which was powered by a 50-horsepower Gnome engine capable of speeds up to 65 miles an hour, and it weighed 800 pounds. His prowess came to the notice of Charles and Sidney King, the proprietors of the Uxbridge Gazette, and so they got in touch with Lee Temple and asked him to give a flying display over Uxbridge. He agreed, and arrangements were made with Lord Hillingdon for the plane to land afterwards in the grounds of his home, Hillingdon Court, off Vide Lane. Tickets were put on sale to gain admission to the field. The Uxbridge and Hillingdon band was booked to provide background music, and the first Uxbridge Scouts agreed to give a display to the waiting crowd. The event was fixed for Boxing Day 1913, and a huge crowd gathered to witness the exhibition flight. However, a 60-mile-per-hour gale blew up, and Temple telegraphed to say that flying was impossible. Wind too strong, better postpone till tomorrow. Clutching their tickets, a large crowd assembled the next day, and just before noon, Temple's aircraft was seen approaching from Harrow. Earlier in the day, the wind had been light, but once again it got up, and it was clear that the tiny aeroplane was being buffeted around in gusts of wind. Interviewed later, Temple said, "At times, I was actually at a standstill. I at last sighted the water tower on Uxbridge Common, but at this particular period, I was having a very bad time, being dashed down 100 feet at a stretch by the constant and terrific gusts I was constrained to meet, and at one point it turned the plane immediately round and I found myself facing Hendon." The currents carried the young man away in the Harefield direction, and then downdrafts forced him to consider an emergency landing. He spotted a gap between two tall trees and was able to guide his fragile craft onto a field at Dew's Farm in Harefield. He just missed a grazing cow. Take-off from there was completely out of the question, and so his mechanics partially dismantled the plane and put it on a lorry and took it back to Hendon by road. But George Lee Temple was determined that his exhibition flight should take place, and so arrangements were made for a further attempt on Saturday, the 3rd of January 1914. This time, to save a long journey, Temple flew to Uxbridge the day before and landed on part of the Hillingdon House farm estate, possibly the area that is now the Viner School playing field, I think. A tent had been erected there, and so the Blériot plane was wheeled in it to spend the night there, and Lee Temple went home to Acton. The next day, the crowds returned to Hillingdon Court, while many others collected in the vicinity of Park Road and the Common. The weather was cloudy, but dry. Lee Temple arrived in the morning and had lunch at a nearby house, the home of a local solicitor, and then travelled the short distance to collect his aeroplane. It was wheeled into a good position, and Temple put on his coat and scarf, turned his cap back to front, and climbed into the cockpit. A smooth takeoff followed, and just after 1 o'clock he flew over Hillingdon Court, circled round, and then landed again on Hillingdon House Farm. This reconnaissance trip enabled Lee Temple to see that a landing there was possible, and he instructed his mechanics to proceed to Vine Lane after he had taken off again. Another smooth takeoff was followed by a thrilling exhibition. The press reported shopkeepers and their customers came to the shop doors to watch the aviator pass over. Many dinner tables were hurriedly left, reported the Gazette. Uxbridge came to a halt as virtually everybody stood up and watched the display in the sky. Vertical dives ended with the tiny plane zooming low over the town, and the pilot could be seen waving to the upturned faces. On one occasion, he actually flew to a great height, shut off the engine, and came down in a corkscrew dive. Local people had never seen the like before, and the display stumped him as an expert in exhibition flying. A further demonstration took place over Hillingdon Court before the onset of rain brought the display to a close. Avoiding the trees, the 21-year-old pilot landed safely and taxied to a point near the enclosure. Cheering greeted his arrival, and he was soon besieged by autograph hunters, and others gathered round to inspect the little plane. A takeoff from there was deemed dangerous, and once again the mechanics dismantled the craft, and it was taken back to Hendon by motor lorry. It had been an unforgettable day, and everyone hoped that the Gazette Airman, as he was now known, would soon be able to return for a repeat performance. But that, alas, was not to be. On the afternoon of Sunday, the 25th of January, just 3 weeks after his Uxbridge display, Temple gave another exhibition flight at Hendon. A strong gust of wind turned the plane over. It hit the ground heavily, and Temple's neck was broken. He died instantly. A verdict of accidental death was recorded at the subsequent inquest, and hundreds attended the funeral at Acton Cemetery. One floral tribute of snowdrops and violets was in the shape of an aeroplane. A local reader contributed a poem to the Gazette. The first verse started like this: "His lifeless form in a mantle lay, free from pain. A hero from our midst has passed away to seek a higher plane."
Very clever. There we go. The newspapers aren't quite so powerful these days, are they, arranging events like that?
No, unfortunately, no. Good.
Well, that was great. Thanks so much, Ken. And
Righty-ho.
we'll put those up on Facebook. They're very popular, it seems. People seem to enjoy these. So
Oh, good.
we'll do some more at another point.